Welcome back to another episode of the Dandelion Podcast, where we talk to the best facilitators, organizers, and hosts using the Dandelion platform at dandelion.events. My name is Stephen Reed, and in this episode, I speak to Sarah Pletts, Tony Pletts, and Bilal Nasim from Embracing Grief. Drawing on the work of people including Malidoma Somé, Francis Weller, and Joanna Macy, Embracing Grief offers group ceremonies and workshops that create brave spaces for people to explore personal, collective, and ancestral grief. The facilitators emphasize that grief work isn't about fixing anything, but rather about creating welcoming containers where all emotions, from numbness to anger to joy, can be safely expressed and witnessed. One of the most surprising aspects of grief work, according to the facilitators, is just how much joy, connection, and even playfulness can emerge when grief is given space to move. They offer various formats from 4-hour online circles to full weekend in-person workshops, making this vital work accessible to different needs and comfort levels. The team is gradually expanding their capacity by bringing on new facilitators, helping to meet the growing need for collective grief practices in these times. I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Embracing Grief. So I'm delighted to be joined today by Tony, Sarah, and Bilal from Embracing Grief. Welcome, everybody.
Hello.
Yeah, to get us started, I wondered if you'd be willing to speak a little bit about your own relationship with grief, what led you each to be interested in doing this work, and perhaps how that relationship to grief has evolved through the work itself. So anyone feeling called to get us going?
So for me, when my first parent died, I was only 23, and it came as a kind of initiation. And I've been fascinated by grief, death, loss, absence, longing ever since, and probably from before then. But I got really interested in it when the kind of celebratory communities I was involved with started to experience abuse and things where people felt they didn't have a place to put the difficult stuff. And I often saw grief as the missing piece that got left out. So I just got really excited by, okay, what are we leaving out and how do we include everything and how do we have space to process all kinds of things?
I guess I got into grief essentially through Sarah, and we often work together in different aspects. And so for me, it was like a balancing act. It felt like so much celebration in my life, but also the other kind of the dark sort of sides of with one's grief and things like that, but actually allowing space for it, and just how that made me feel much more balanced as a person. So it was an accidental discovery, but then something that I became passionate about through experience.
I think the first grief tending I ever went to was with one of our teachers, Sophie Banks, in Devon. And it was a 4 or 5 day deep dive in person thing, which for someone who hadn't really even related or referred to the term grief was like jumping off the cliff. But then I did jump off the cliff, and I was carrying a lot of stuck feeling and emotion, particularly anger, around lacking relationship with my dad, who was alive at the time. And I suppose there was two things that happened. The first thing was that during those 4 days, I got to access these parts of me, these feeling parts of me, which felt very, very far away for many decades. So that was quite wild at the individual level. But almost as wild, if not even more striking, was the quality of the space. It was like as psychedelic or as altered a consciousness as I'd ever experienced in my life. It was, but obviously it's completely sober, nothing apart from just there in group and doing these practices. And that's what the first piece was very healing. The second piece was the hook. It's hooked. It's like, what on earth happened to me? I almost had to go backwards and be like, what actually just happened to me and what happened to us? And so that's what led me to then go to lots more grief pieces and then slowly do the apprenticing with Sophie.
I guess it would be helpful if you would describe a little bit about what is actually going on at these Embracing Grief workshops, ceremonies, then, for people that are not so familiar with this work?
So unlike something traditional like bereavement counselling, we work in a group, and it's the magic of the group that is really crucial. And we use very much embodied practices and slow things down. And we use creative approaches. Sometimes we might use writing or drawing, or have a more whole experience perhaps than something that is just a talk therapy. We very much call on ritual and simple practices. You don't have to have a belief system, but we use simple practices to work in a really different way to the way that many therapeutic offerings happen these days. There's not just the fact that we're stepping across thresholds into a group, but we're also doing stuff together that we may be unfamiliar with. We may have got deep learning and longing to be with ritual, but have no idea what that means. We may have been wounded by childhood relationships with faith or not. And it's often something people are really hungry for, but they don't even know until they taste it. I love what Bilal has just said about his first experience of it. That's really common. People taste it and experience it as a sort of medicine and are like, whoa, what happened then is really common experience.
Tony or Bilal, do you want to underline any other ways in which your approach is different to more conventional therapeutic approaches to dealing with grief?
Yeah, I think primarily it would be we've been brought into certain lineages and practices that, as Sarah mentioned, use group ritualistic practices to create a container for everyone to witness each other in their feeling. So that's not really what happens in, say, things like bereavement counseling or other type of psychotherapeutic approaches where it's very much one-to-one. The closest thing to it might be a bereavement kind of sharing or grief sharing space. Like I've attended a lot of death cafes in my time. Often they're a type of grief actual exercise where everyone's sharing about what's happening for them. I think for me, I suppose the lineages in particular that we've been brought into, there's a certain use of like symbols in the sense that using ritual to be able to create a certain direction and flow for grief to travel. And as Sarah mentioned, you don't have to have any cosmology or belief system to underwrite it. But there's this sense in which we're using the power of symbol, we're using the quality of nature, we're using the quality of objects to give some direction to what we're feeling, not with the purpose of trying to exile it, but just give it a flow and a direction. And when you do that in a group, it can be almost like a durational performance art piece, but actually no one's performing. They're actually all expressing and feeling, but it has that certain quality to it, which I don't think is certainly not what I've experienced in more traditional approaches, certainly not one-to-one. And there's a certain quality of that doing it in a group. It's not just we're doing it in a group, working with our own stuff, and then you're working with your stuff, and we're doing that together. We're active in each other's experience through the fact that we're witnessing each other. We go beyond witnessing each other, we go into holding, like the container, holding the safety, the patchwork of safety that's created. That's a collective effort. It's not a kind of facilitator led, it's actually very much collaborative. And I think that feels quite different to what I've experienced in more traditional ways.
Something else you mentioned in the writing is that you're not trying to fix anything. So Tony, wondered if you wanted to pick up on that point and anything else.
Yes, just to back up what Bilal said, is that it's often at its most powerful in what we call we space. It's not us as some kind of authority and then people who are coming as participants. We build a sense of safety and community. And then in that community, we hold we space. We are grievers as well. We're not there to offer any particular words of advice, but there's something in that we space, in that communal space that is very healing, or can be, the fact that we're holding each other and we're expressing as well. And that is what I think is, for me, completely different from the therapeutic approach. And in terms of the fixing, that's for me, again, that's really important, that people are given the space to express and not necessarily be encumbered by a lot of opinions of you should do this or you should do that. There is a sense of a bit like the race is the prize, the beauty is in the holding and the sharing and the giving space to grief. And that allows things to move. And when things move, you get the opportunity of other emotions coming in as well. So yeah, the no fixing thing is really important. We're not here as trained people with any kind of authority, pass any kind of judgment on or any kind of advice. And that allows people to bring things forward with safety in many respects.
Although I have heard that you are trained in various ways and that you are associated even with various lineages. Maybe you want to mention some of the teachers and lineages that have inspired you or you have trained with.
We've apprenticed to grief, as it's known, with Sophie Banks and Jeremy Thress. And we draw on the lineages of Sobonfu Somé in particular, Malidoma Somé of the Dagara people in Burkina Faso. Draw on Francis Weller's work and Joanna Macy, Martine Prechtel, Peter Levine, and many others. So this is a weave that was brought together by Maeve Gavin originally with Sobonfu Somé's blessing that brings together some of the indigenous practices in a way that includes neuroscience and a more Western approach to make it work for an urban metropolitan audience who may or may not have any spiritual tradition. So to really welcoming all in and opening the doors as wide as possible for many different experiences. And how it looks is also really different. I just really want to name not feeling. There can be this real tyranny that expressing feelings has to look cathartic, has to look a certain way. But actually, we're really just welcoming all of us in whatever shape that turns up. And that may include not feeling or numbness or shame. All of this is welcome at our door.
Yeah, maybe just to build on that a little bit and looping it back in with the fixing. I think for me personally, this is not a statement of fact, the biggest thing about not needing and not trying to fix or change anyone, for me, it's less about what we might or might not have to say, but more that the actual acceptance and welcoming of these parts of ourselves is where a great part of any type of feeling of healing might reside. It's that, as Sophie Banks, one of our teachers, and others would describe, often trauma is a kind of trauma, and suffering generally is twofold. You experience the suffering associated with the shock or the more longer term series of mini shocks. But then there's the other piece, which is that there was nowhere to go to where it felt okay to have that. Either, if you were like me, you were gently railroaded into being told it was all fine, or there were no actual people to take it to who could just sit there and witness the fact that you are in some type of state which would be considered suffering for you. It's that lack of home for that feeling, for that part, for that place, or for that experience, which is sometimes causes more suffering than the initial stressor. And that's for me the point of the no fixing. At its nutshell, it's like it doesn't even matter what the solution is. Let's just really be as welcoming and as accepting of the peace as possible. And I think much of that has come from all of those lineages that Sarah has described. That I think with therapeutic practices, and by the way, I fully support therapeutic practices. So none of this is creating a hierarchy, just the difference is that they have their function, that people are seeking some type of direction to move in. And I think there's also room for really honoring where you are as well.
There's no doubt that this is a very powerful energy that you folks are working with, yet your testimonials frequently mention feeling safe and held in the spaces that you're creating. So I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about how exactly you are building trust and helping participants to feel supported in these quite intimate settings.
I like to say that this isn't safe work. We're playing football in emotional minefields, but we aim for brave space. So a space where the possibility of being vulnerable is an option. And one of the ways we do that is to make sure that people really feel that everything is optional. So to really give permission to do and to not do, to really allow people to come in their own unique way, to include many different ways, and to really give people agency that they can find their own way of doing something. And one of the pieces we use is to create group agreements, but there are many other ways in which we slow down, we create an embodied sense of welcome and presence. And for some people that will really work, for others it won't. And that's part of this, is we're just honoring that people are really different, and they will all have really different unique journeys and unique experiences. And this concept of welcoming is super important in that.
I think that we called ourselves Embracing Grief, the groups that we're running, because we are literally doing that. We are embracing our grief, as for often it's an aspect of love. And for instance, in terms of building that safety of being just able to step into that and be witnessed and be held in that. And yeah, that safety comes from even from an opening round where people may just give a very brief synopsis of where they are. Now, if you were in if you were in a workshop that wasn't about grief, it would be quite disorientating to hear this person say certain things or that person to say certain things, and you'd think, wow, this is going to be complex. But when you're actually in a grief tending space, when people talk about those things and they're witnessed, it gives everyone permission to deepen. And that safety comes from that group sharing and holding and witnessing.
Yeah, it's an interesting question about safety, because as both have alluded to, the very nature of what's people are being offered the opportunity to do or experience is in the moment doesn't feel safe. That's why it's typically not regularly easily expressed and witnessed. And so I find that there's almost like different levels of safety that you can bring into the space. It happens at more visible levels, like what Sarah was describing in terms of the very structure is built in with exercises to confer safety. But then there are subtle things which I will never understand, but I do see the benefits of. Some of the rituals and the practices that we've been passed on, they embody and carry a certain collective safety, which is what Tony is speaking to, which I will never be able to articulate. Like, I'm pretty certain about that, but I felt it so bodily, and people do. There's a certain holding which allows you to feel like you're not an aberration. You're not wrong. There's no wrongness in what you're with. And I think at the heart of it, that's the kernel of safety, I would say, that we're trying to reach.
So another thing I saw in your writing about the retreats is that you say that you work with personal, collective, and ancestral grief. So I'm not actually that familiar with these different forms of grief myself. So I wonder if you could help us understand the difference and the ways in which they might interact or play into one another.
Personal grief is in some way the simplest, is probably not the right word, but in some way the most straightforward, in that we experience things in our lives and that gets stored in the system in some way. And then the grief work is to find ways to allow that to have some movement, some flow, and be witnessed in that. I think much of, well, at least some of our personal grief is shared. I would go as far as to say that a lot of our individual level grief is in some way tapping into something which is relatable. I can't remember who said the quote, but something like what's most personal is most common, something like that. I can't quite remember, but there's something about in those moments where people might be expressing grief, which is ostensibly about quite different material circumstances, but there's a light of coherence that can go off in you, in a person, in me, which just immediately brings me closer, that collectivity. And then we also do these rituals and practices and workshops for certain groups as well. I've held spaces for people of color, we've done it for men, Sarah holds spaces for queer groups and so on. And there, the kind of collective is really a bit more explicit in that certain groups experience certain types of experiences which are shared in a different way, often underrepresented or underappreciated, and that creates a certain solidarity and requires a certain level of connection and familiarity with each other on those grounds to be able to really go there. I think the ancestral is, as we get from personal towards ancestral, I think it's more entering the world of speculation in my part. I don't mean speculation in a negative way. It gets, for me, a bit trickier to pin exactly what the word even means. There's a lot of biological, evolutionary, epigenetic stuff on the passing of trauma across generations. So there's some harder evidence, but even the hardness of that is an interesting one to try and grapple with. But I think on the more deeper visions of ancestral, I think a lot of people do feel, and I felt this at times and I still do, that some things we carry don't feel like ours. They feel old, they feel ancient, they have the quality of being like stone, not just in terms of hardness, but in terms of like age. You're carrying something. And I take that, if not at face value, I treat that really seriously, that when people are bringing that, they're bringing something. And I think it's too easily dismissed. And then certainly in the traditions that we've been connected to, which aren't necessarily ours, they would treat much of this work as working with ancestral experience and connecting to the ancestral stories. But yeah, that's some words on that for me.
Yeah, I might add to that that so many griefs are actually interconnected. And even though they may come from those different perspectives, if I look at myself, a while ago, I might have been doing grief tending around a particular relationship that was impacting me. And then if I'm working with that, then I start to realize actually what I'm grieving is not necessarily just that relationship, is also connected to grief around my relationship with my mother. And then that connects obviously to a whole ancestral thing. So it's a bit like pulling a thread or a string. You might start somewhere, but it may take you to lots of different places that weave all those elements together. They're all interconnected.
I might just add something around one of the things that we hope to offer is to give people more of a kind of map of the kinds of sources of grief that may be interacting in your system. There may be some really existential collective responses to what's happening in the world at the moment, or to what's happening in a specific place because you've got a direct relationship with it. And there may be things that are really nebulous, things from the past. And these things may land in your system either as layers or a tangle. There may be, what is our entanglement with collective systems of harm? And how on earth do we begin to feel that and to sit with the discomfort of that? So often the thread that you are able to tug is often the personal, because it allows us in to a doorway, but what it connects with may be a really complicated interweaving of things. And people may also feel like they're hugely impacted by something that may appear to be, on the surface of it, something quite small, but it may be interacting with these layers in a way that gives people a sense of, oh, no wonder I'm feeling like that. It can really open people's eyes. They may not know why they come. They may come with one really impactful experience or a bereavement or something that's very direct, but they may think, oh, wait a minute, how does that relate to something else that happened to me? The landscape of my own system and how things are landing in that.
To take one example of sorts, one topic that certainly had some airtime over the past years is climate and ecological grief. You mentioned also Joanna Macy, who I know is someone that has written very eloquently on this topic. Yeah, anything to say about how that particular type of grief may or may not be showing up in your work?
It's It can be foreground or background. It's really common that it's so big that it's too overwhelming to feel. So I'd say probably the most common response is disconnection because it is too big, or overwhelm because it's too big. It's always present, it's always in the room, but how it shows up can really vary. And for some people, it's front and center. And there isn't a right or wrong in this. For not feeling at that kind of level of disconnection is a reasonable response. Grief is a series of natural responses to bereavement, loss, absence, and it's a perfectly reasonable response. And yet that in itself can also invoke other responses from us, guilt or shame or all kinds of thought, anger. And the question is, how do we sit with the discomfort of that? And for me, part of the intention of bringing this work forward is very much to be in alignment with how can we connect as best we can with that discomfort, so that we might actually be able to be with it, sit with it, do something about it, present with the conundrums and the complexity that life currently holds.
I thought it was interesting that you actually named some other powerful emotions there, like guilt and shame and anger. And I had the thought that, just as Tony, I think you mentioned, like the personal can be the pathway into the collective and the ancestral, it sounded like the grief can be the pathway into shame or anger or these other emotions. It sounds like there's quite a diversity of different emotional responses, even for a given person, across the hours that you're working together.
Yeah, it might be worth, on that note, almost framing what we even refer to as grief in our sessions, that typically and quite reasonably the sort of regular understanding of grief is that it's sorrow, it's sadness, it's tears. Actually, our frame of grief is to include anger, to include shame, to include any type of feeling that there might be some type of internal tension with. So I might have a feeling that I have some sort of internal tension with the fact that I even feel that thing. It's just not readily. And even if I don't have a tension with that thing, it can still be grief, but we include numbness as a form of grief. And in fact, a big part of my way into grief in my early years was by dealing with my numbness. And the way I dealt with my numbness was to speak to out loud how feeling numb made me feel. And like it would quite generally just take me into some other type of feeling, which was a bit more hot rather than the cold numbness. Like I was angry actually that I was numb. And that's a form of grief in itself. And I think when it relates to the kind of ecological piece, I think like all sources of grief are equal in terms of not being prioritized one over the other. I think some do access more existential pieces relating to the bigger questions, the bigger worries. They might have a bit more direct line into more difficult places like terror, real fear or awe or big feelings. And so I think it's quite right. And I've for many years felt numb to my relationship with climate crisis. I think in more recent years, and for a lot of people when they experience it over time, is that connecting more to my grief around the climate, to the environment, has been the single biggest cause of me becoming closer and more connected to nature. They almost go hand in hand for me personally. It's almost like my numbness towards it emotionally created a numbness towards it physically and relationally. If I could begin at the edges to undo that, then actually I could begin to start building. And then lo and behold, I start moving to Devon, and then I start spending more time in nature, and suddenly that becomes its own wheel of like force. Yeah.
I love this piece at the beginning around like grief as tension. So almost imagining how it would be to call this work embracing tension and how that might land with folks differently. So something else that you've written about is that you bring your background or backgrounds as artists into this work. And you mentioned, Bilal, earlier about how sometimes it's almost like a kind of co-created performing arts ceremony. So what is the role of ritual and art in the ceremonies as you're conducting them?
I think it's probably fair to mention that we three met clowning, which I think is really important in terms of our approach to the work. It's about bringing all of us, including our joyful, quirky ways of being, and how we're inviting an invitation to open into the whole of life. And that's a very creative way of living, of being. And I feel that's something that underpins the work that we do together. But in a practical way, it's often through making beauty and bringing in song and poetry and finding these other channels and including those and offering those in ways that we might not be able to fully understand, but also to really make space for something different, a different way.
The Dalai Lama says about Buddhism, I'm only practicing. And that's the same for us. We're just practicing. And there is something really beautiful about being able to create a space and to give it personality. And often when we create a space, we create it with the group so they have a vested interest. And the presence of ritual, again, it's just one of those things that allows us to move from the default world into a more liminal space. And for me, in terms of the background that I bring, because grief is such an essential part of love and an essential ingredient of our lives, I feel that it's a practice that allows me to bring all of myself. It welcomes the complexity of the sort of the human form, and it allows me as a facilitator to draw on all the incredible experience I've had in life, in whether it's travel or running a business or creative enterprises. All of those things are part of me, and I draw on in the practice of grief tending.
For me, actually, grief work is inherently artistic. Yeah, it is artistic, separate to bringing art to it. And I think because it really works within the world of symbols, as does art. It's designed to move the psyche, as does art, in ways which aren't always explainable. And in a particular, as relates to a particular world of art, there's an invitation to go into improvisation. I think that's why, like, sometimes I've brought in fooling and clowning exercises as part of grief work. And it's about how can we find that part of us which doesn't know the script, because the script typically doesn't integrate and express easily what we're feeling, if that feeling we have tension around or is grief. And yeah, I see the whole, whilst it's not performance, I feel it is art.
I'm curious to know what surprised you most about this work. And we could add to that maybe any ways in which your own attitudes or relationship towards grief have changed since actually offering this.
I think something that we all see over and over again, and something that initially surprised me and now I just enjoy, is quite how much fun and silliness and pleasure and joy may erupt. And I think it's fair to say the longer the experience, so in a 7-day, there's a lot more fun and silliness than in a 4-hour. But that certainly in 1 or 2 days, often there's a kind of unexpected warmth or humor that just surfaces. Because there's this thing, if we've been holding part of ourselves under a bit of a lid, then when that is welcomed in, if there's a bit of movement, actually what can emerge is the other place of actually gratitude, relief, joy. And not for everyone and not all the time, but it's a common thing. Yeah.
I think for me, that's a record. Absolutely, I was going to leap in and say, it's the joyfulness. It's the fact that these workshops at the end are nearly always leave you with a feeling of hope, of being uplifted, of celebratory, and really particularly connection to the fellow human beings who have been with you. And that was a real surprise for me, is that, and we can't in the publicity say, hey, come to a grief tending weekend and have a real laugh. It would be very counterproductive. But that does seem to be that sense of levity at the end feels so important. But I think people imagine grief tending is that we get together and everyone shares a bit of miserableness and we drag each other down. There is a sort of sense that, whereas actually it's the complete opposite of that we get together and we share, and that sharing leads to being able to move through and to find joyfulness and celebration amidst things that we're not solving, but just that we're giving space and attention to. So yeah, the joy.
And how about this piece of how being up close to grief for some years now has changed your own attitudes towards it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say with that. I think the two biggest things that come up for me is, again, like visually or symbolically, whenever anyone chooses, like we all get bumped or whooshed or something happens to us a couple of times a day, probably. And actually, if you pulled on that thread, half the time it might lead to something quite deep, what might be considered grief. And the more experience and the more familiar I am with my grief, the more I'm willing to pull on that thread in the day or in the evening or during the week. And there's almost the symbol of analogy I've given before, is that every time I choose to allow myself to feel that grief, I cross a bridge and I leave a little bit of the sole of my foot on that bridge. And then I return and I leave a little bit of the sole of my foot on that bridge on the return. And every time I leave a bit of myself, it just strengthens the bridge. So that next time it's even easier to cross and come back. And then next time it's even easier to cross and come back. And now I honestly, I'm not even joking. Like when I feel like a bit of grief coming, I'm like, my whole body relaxes. I'm like, yes, great. I get to feel, I'll get to be in my heart. Brilliant. Cross that bridge, come back. I think that's one piece. And I think the other piece is connected to what surprised Sarah and Tony, like relating to that joy piece around my bandwidth for feeling full stop has just widened almost proportionally to how familiar I am with my grief. It's just, for me personally, I can't, and I think many people can't selectively numb out of feeling. It's like a global nuclear button that we experience difficult stuff, so we just numb the whole thing out. But that means we numb out feeling, we numb out joy, we numb out eros, we numb out pleasure, we numb out humor, we numb out expression, facial expression, embodiment. And just feeling myself come more and more into a wider version of me has been really joyful, actually.
I think I want to add something about the intensity of sitting with people, alongside them, with them. And it's a bit like being in a crucible. And there's something for me about that it's really strengthened me. And it's really increased my capacity to be with the unknown, the difficult. And what I feel that I'm growing in myself is the capacity to elder. And I think for many of us, there's been this absence of appropriate elders or people that we feel that we can trust to hold us. I think we're wired to expect being held and to have that sense of community. Grief work is work that benefits the whole community. So where it may just be some people coming, we really believe that has impact for a wider group of people who they may come into contact with. And for me, it's really important. Is what do we need in these times? We need ways to process what's difficult. We need to hold steady, to have capacity to hold one another. And for me, that's what this work is part of. It's one of many ways to really hold steady and be willing to engage with life and to elder.
Yeah, I just briefly adding to that, Nick Cave talks about after he lost his son and being so deeply immersed in his grief. And for him, it was through various projects that he took on, it was about finding a language for grief. And that language can be expression, it can be words, it can be all sorts of different things. But if you have that communication and that language, that for him, he said, was his beginning of his pathway out. And I think with grief tending, we are creating a situation where we are embracing the possibility of finding language together.
And I imagine the work doesn't stop when the ceremony or the workshop finishes that day. Yeah, is there anything to say about integration and how the people that are participating in this work are staying in touch or able to continue this work even after the days that you gather?
Sure, I can speak to that. It's almost there's a during the event integration, and then there's after the event integration. They're different things. I think a big part, and I think this has particularly been brought in by Maeve and Sophie and others to quite a large degree, of the soothing process of bringing the nervous system back to what is required to go and orient towards the default world, where you're going to have to go and get sardines from Tesco's and get a bus maybe, or like the real life stuff, which is not designed to be able to be a safe container for your big feeling or emotion. So there's a certain way in which we are creating a transitional preparation phase to return back to life, as it were. And that's often just a lot of nervous system soothing, and also a kind of partly self-soothing, but also some co-regulating work as well. And there's different ways in which that emerges. The afterwards, it's really about, we ask people quite explicitly to connect with someone who they trust, a kind of a safe, concerned other who will just be with them, hear their experience, listen to them, be there for what they might want to share in terms of what they've integrated or what they've learned. And that takes us so far in terms of integrating. One of the things which I think is a classic thing. I don't want to say Western because it's such a loose term, but like of a certain mindset, which is sometimes, okay, great, I'm going to do this thing and it's going to change everything. And then after that, I'm on this new place and everything's going to be different, really clearly different and better. And actually, in a lot of the traditions we've been brought into, it's like a practice. It's that no one expects to sit down and meditate and suddenly just be in a step shift change of consciousness. So it's similarly, it's like almost the more you grieve and the more regularly grieve, the easier it is to grieve, and also the insights or what the space allows for other pieces over time. And so a big part of integration is actually try and find time to do more in some way, whether that's personally with others or in group. And indeed, in the Dagara tradition, they would have community, like village grief tending rituals every weekend. And you would just be expected to go because, as Sarah mentioned, if you're not doing your grief work, then you're probably passing that on inadvertently to someone else through not being as relational as you could or being as kind as you could. Yeah.
So just how much potential does this work have for the world right now then? Like, how would the world be different if most people on the planet were doing grief rituals every week or something like this?
So this is one practice that is really great at processing and bringing people back into a more ground state that is more balanced, more even. And you can come and do it regularly. It's cheap. I say it's cheap in terms of an intervention. It's comparatively cheap. It requires very little tools. It's repeatable at scale. We've done it we regularly have groups of about 12 people, but we've done festivals where we have workshops of 150. We did a ritual at Medicine Festival for at least a couple of hundred people. So it's possible to taste the work at scale. It's something that's easy to come back and do. People may be working with a theme, or they may come back intermittently, but we regularly have returners. Pretty much every group will have 1, 2, 3, 4 coming back. So people recognize it as something that might just top them up to come and let's taste some of this. And people are coming in fairly large numbers to experience the apprenticing. I'm also teaching on the apprenticing with Sophie Banks and Jeremy Thress. So people are recognizing it. Oh, this has potential in these times. The main problem is people don't know about it, or people are scared to move towards it. And I'd love to make it more possible to feel that they can move towards it. I love the fact that people who come to our workshops are really diverse in age, class, gender, demographic, culture. We have quite a broad spectrum of people to come, and I'm really celebrating that. But let's get more of them through the door. Word of mouth seems to be the way it's spreading most. Yeah, and let's hope people listen to this and are inspired.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that briefly, I think there's also scope for, and like my partner's a therapist, and there's loads of instances where she will be working with clients and it'll be like internally, because she's familiar with the grief work now herself, but also through me, she's like, you need to do some grieving. There's a piece there. And I feel as though there's a kind of almost like a new paradigm version of therapy, which is interdisciplinary. And like I have these visions of, imagine you had these places where you do get the whatever therapy you need, and then you almost get recommended, here's a grief ritual for you, and here's actually some somatics work for you, and here's this piece, and here's that piece, and then you come back to me. And I think there's something in that in the longer run, to not make grief feel quite so disconnected from the other aspects of the therapeutic world.
The thought arises that in some small way you've described what Dandelion is becoming as a portal where people can find all these different kinds of practices, many of them held in groups or containers. And yeah, so delighted that grief is shown alongside the cacao ceremonies and the ecstatic dance and as one very important path in this world. So you've got several events coming up, ranging from 4-hour online circles to full weekend in-person workshops, which sound like quite different things to me. Yeah, I'm curious if you could explain a little bit about how these different formats of events are serving different needs and creating different possibilities, maybe for different groups of people.
I think often people, if you're just starting with something, you want to dip your toe in the water. You don't necessarily want to completely dive in. And obviously, the more you immerse yourself in something, the potential, the greater the sort of rewards and understanding. But it feels like a really important practice to be able to offer tasters and then intermediary and then much longer opportunities, because exploring grief is like exploring love. It's an endless world inside. It feels like a little entrance that says the word grief, but when you get inside, it's a cathedral-sized space that allows for just all kinds of sort of connection and understanding. So yeah, it's essentially a lot of the things we do have a very similar pattern, but they allow for different levels of access, both with the group that you're with and with yourself.
Anything that you'd like to say about any particular events coming up?
Maybe just to add that maybe some people are surprised that you can do grief online. But frankly, so are we. Before we started doing it quite a few years ago during COVID, we were like, this isn't going to work. Let's just try it anyway. And we did. And it does work. And I think for me anyway, the thread between all of the online, in-person, longer sessions is really just two things: that we're there as a group witnessing each other and being witnessed. There's again a sort of like a very difficult to articulate type of quality to that, which carries over onto online sessions. And also there's something about this direction. A lot of people feel stuck in their deep emotions, and it's almost like you feel it, but then it just gets moved somewhere else, and then you have to feel that. And this direction, adding direction to our grief, that can also be done online. And I think for the upcoming ones, if you're unsure and you want to dip a toe, then the 4-hour online session is a really great taster. If some people really only like the in-person, but many people actually really feel the value of the online. And then for the weekend journeys, for some people, they don't need tasters, and the weekend journey is sometimes a taster. And yeah, it's an opportunity to dive deeper, to have more spaciousness as well. Sometimes it's about not doing anything, to be able to connect to what's there. And so the 1 day and the 2 day are going to be offering that as well.
I see that there's a third facilitator mentioned for some of the in-person work. Sade, is that how I say this person's name?
Amashade. Amashade is another fabulous Embracing Grief co-facilitator. We're gradually growing the team. We're stretching our capacity by including more of us. And yeah, it's a real delight to have Amashade working with us. She's a fantastic celebrant, and in larger events also leads the drumming. But it's great to have richness of diversity in our team as well. We each bring different and beautiful qualities.
Well, it's so wonderful to hear that this work is growing and you're bringing new people on board. And I'm really delighted it's part of the work that's on offer through Dandelion. It clearly is playing a very important role there. So yeah, thank you for hosting it on the platform. And yeah, wishing you many successes with it for many years to come.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yay!